you. I guess we should introduce ourselves first. You want to go first? Should I go first? Okay. It's very kind of you. Thank you. Okay, I'm Manav Sachdeva. I am not Ukrainian, so just to be clear, I am Indian American. And we lived there about 6 years in Ukraine, and I have worked mostly with the United Nations. Also currently working on the UNICEF Afghanistan desk more as a consultant. And but in Ukraine, I was much more of a trailing spouse. So while also doing consulting, so I've written a long story thanks to Nicole right there. Yay to her in-laws also visiting from Chicago, and we'll talk a bit more about Ukraine. But just wanted to tell you guys who I am, and Nigora will tell her story. And then the way the talk will be is I'm going to do a quick overview of broadly what Ukraine is and where my story fits in and all. And Nigora, since she was the head of human rights there in the Donbass region, will really paint the picture on the ground of the conflict and stuff. And we're also happy to have esteemed Ukrainians in the crowd, Nadia, Olga, and many others. So thank you so much, and big grateful thank you to Bogosia for making this beautiful poster also. Thank you.
Hi dear friends, good morning. Thank you so much for having us today. It's a great honor to speak about Ukraine for me personally. I and my family, we lived in Ukraine since 2016, from 2016 until February 2022. My first foray to the country was with the UN Refugee Agency in Dnipro, where I was responsible for gender aspects of humanitarian aid. Then my work took me to Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, where we spent 2 years. I was working as minority rights advisor with the Regional Security Organization, covering the entire country. And my third and last assignment was in eastern Ukraine, where I was heading a field office covering the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, also known as the Donbass. Speaking about Ukraine is a huge responsibility, and I believe it has to be done correctly, with due respect to its history, culture, and people. And I really thought long and hard how to approach this task. So what I decided today is that I'm going to be speaking through 5 Ukrainians that I had the privilege to know or meet during the course of my work in that country. I would like also to acknowledge the presence of our Ukrainian friends here. As Manav mentioned, Nadia is here, Angelina is here, Olga is here. So I would like to invite them to also share their personal stories, because they still have their family members living through the war in Ukraine right now. So their account is also very important, and it's going to be first-hand information that you'll be able to hear. Also, I would like to acknowledge Ismini. Ismini lived and worked in Ukraine for many years as well. She's with the Greek embassy. We are really good friends. We know each other since our times in Ukraine, and our kids go to the same school. I'll be mentioning a leader of the Greek community of Ukraine, and Ismini, I'll invite you also to chip in to update us on the latest fact of Alexander's life. So with that, I'd like to pass the mic to Manav so he can do his broad introduction. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I don't know. I'm married well, didn't I? Okay. Broadly speaking, I just want to kind of first share a personal story. I met Ukrainians for the first time when I was a freshman in college. And that 30-year friendship, I'll show you the story of it. I was in California, and I had 2 really wonderful friends, Sasha and Serhii, who became like my roommates. I mean, the meaning of friendship for them, for Ukrainians, is really deep, really wonderful. They really will treat you like blood brothers or blood sisters. So we shared space in California together, and then Fast forward to 2016, I arrived in Nigora. We were in Michigan, where I fell afoul with some authorities, not legal, but with the university. I have a bit of an intolerance for certain bad behavior in some boardrooms. Bottom line, we came to Ukraine, and we ended up first in Dnipropetrovsk, Dnipro, the Ukrainian Dnipro. And I started to learn about, what is Ukraine's aspirations, what is Ukraine like, what are Ukrainians, in a proper way beyond just my friends. Your friends are friends, but I think it's very important to understand from this story, like what I'm starting to paint is that I arrived thinking that Ukrainians and Russians essentially are same people or similar people, or yes, they were and they are cousins or Slavic, but the idea is that once from 2016 I started living there, I realized that the aspirations of Ukrainians are very, very different. They have had the Orange Revolution, they've had further other the struggles in their freedom, and their choice to want to be aligned to the West had nothing to do with this idea that there will be a lot of things that, pardon me, as an Indian American, I can say this, a lot of people here in this part of the world feel like, oh, it's just about, the US provoked it, or if NATO didn't put, nukes, or if it could be neutral, or if it I realized first, Ukrainians don't want what Russia is offering. They want a post-Soviet, modern, really European future for themselves. Okay, they really do. I mean, and they're well within their right to want it. So, coming back to this moment of the conflict, 2016 in Dnipro, we were there. Then we moved to Kiev. I noticed that people fundamentally really don't want the baggage of the cultural, the political, and the stranglehold that the Soviet state had on people's lives and imagination. So, I think it's very, very important to understand why this conflict started and why this is, from 2014 on, and prior to that, there's troubles. That there's aspirations in the Ukrainian people that just were not acknowledged. Secondly, I'd just like to say that even if Ukraine remained neutral and did not care, like so-called whatever neutral according to Russia, Russia still imagines it says Malinki Rus. Malinki Rus means like, so there's Belarus, which is White Russia, and there's Malinki Rus, which is small, and then there's Big Russia, Mother Russia, Russia itself. I'm not trying to be anti-Russian, I'm just trying to say that politically for people to understand that it imagined that its second project of the creation of Soviet Union 2.0 or EEU, the European Eurasian Union, is incomplete without taking over Ukraine. And so I think the Ukrainian right to defend themselves is not about just our, let's say, as an American, our support or not. We are supporting them because they were fighting for their dignity, for their freedom, for their right to exist. So I think that that's something that my Ukrainian friends wanted that, to make sure that it was shared. What can I say? What gets emotional about this stuff? I have a lot of stuff to share, but yeah, I think so. I think I'm going to come back to what is my formal talk after Nigora tells you more the human rights picture. So broadly speaking, as you know, this is Eastern Europe, Poland and Baltic states here, Russia on this side. They're sandwiched in the middle. They want to not be towards Russia in the cultural and political imagination. That doesn't mean they're hostile towards Russians. Russians were able to come in and live. So please, the propaganda that Russians could not carry out their language in the country or talk, please, there's a lot of propaganda around it. So Ukraine is really fighting for all of us, for the right to be free in our choices and right to live. I'm going to speak up later. I'm getting a little emotional.
Thank you. I think I can also speak on behalf of my Central Asian sisters and brothers, as somebody who was born and brought up in Uzbekistan, that we are all rooting for Ukraine. I just wish our smaller countries had the courage to stand up, to actually claim their right, and to determine their own foreign policy, internal policy, etc. I wish, I mean, nowadays in the media, if you read various languages, Russian armies are being compared to hordes. Hordes meaning the hordes that were attacking Slavic states in 13th century, meaning it's a reference to Genghis Khan, it's a reference to Asians in a broader sense. And I feel ashamed that we Asians from Central Asia, Crimean Tatars, etc., Tatars, broader people from Kazakhstan, Mongolia, we became such a low benchmark. You know, we don't want to be associated with this negative image as uncivilized people. And I think Ukraine's war, I think the war in Ukraine has to put a full stop to this. We're all really tired of Russia the bully, and we would like to be completely independent. People in Central Asia want to live in democratic societies, not in kleptocratic regimes that sold their dignity, their independence to Big Brother Russia. So I really hope that the war ends with a full and complete victory for Ukraine. And the rest, I mean, I hope, you know, the justice will prevail. So with that, a little bit emotional, also I'm getting emotional, interlude, I'd like to proceed with the presentation. So the way I structured the presentation is that it consists of videos and photographs, mostly of them taken by us, Manav and me, during our years in Ukraine. If their photographs belong to somebody else, I have indicated in the corners. So, as I mentioned, I'll be bringing you the voices of 5 Ukrainians that I had the privilege to work with. These 5 individuals taught me courage, humility, and perseverance. And I believe their voices deserve to be heard. So I'll start with the capital of Ukraine, Kyiv. This used to be my regular train ride from Kyiv to eastern Ukraine, intercity train that takes 6 hours to get from the capital all the way to eastern Ukraine, to Kramatorsk, where my office used to be located.
So, sorry, Kramatorsk. Kramatorsk is the regional headquarters of the Donbass region. What you hear about the conflict for this 2014, I don't know if everyone knows.
It's the regional capital of the Donetsk region, yes. But that's where the UN had a kind of large presence, and our office was also there. And from Kramatorsk, we used to cover the Luhansk and Donetsk regions, also known as the Greater Donbass area. So this used to be a train ride.
So this was the region that was occupied since 2014. The first, you know.
I mean, part of it.
Yeah,
let's be factual,
yeah.
yes. So you can see from the train, beautiful river Dnipro. You can see Kyiv Pechersk cave monastery. You can see the Mother of Victory. I'm sorry, the video is a little bit blurry. It didn't come out really well when I transferred it to the PowerPoint. But I want to mention just a brief history of Kyiv. Why is it important? Kyiv is the capital of Ukraine, and it is one of the most populous cities in Europe. So every time you hear Russia is shelling Kyiv, think about that one of the most populous cities in Europe is being shelled. Its history dates back as far as 5th century. Kyiv was the center of Kievan Rus, a Slavic state that existed from 9th century to 13th century. Modern nations of Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine all claim Kievan Rus as their cultural ancestor. You can also hear a lot of reference to Kievan Rus in Putin's speeches, if you follow closely. The Kyiv region was briefly occupied by Russia from February to April 2022. Russia left behind devastation and death. The evidence of the Russian crimes, including graphic photographs from Borodyanka, Moshchun, Hostomel, Bucha, and other settlements caused a global outcry. But before we get to that, I'd like to share with you some photographs of pre-war Kiev, just so you can see the beauty of the city. This is Saint Sofia. It's one of the cultural heritages of Ukraine, and also the Kiev's symbol. The base, the foundation of the cathedral was laid in 11th century. It has gorgeous art pieces inside, as you can see. Kiev was and still is just a cool place to be. It has really fantastic urban culture. It has a lot of young people, beautiful cafes, very modern infrastructure, and it also has great murals. As an aspiring artist, I always pay attention to these things, and here are some of them that we took a picture of in central Kiev. This is a very symbolic one, actually. This is, please, Ukrainian friends, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is basically Ukraine chopping off the encroaching hand of Russia. And it's right in the city center near the landscape alley, Bizarna Aliyah. So when I was thinking about who I want to speak about, somebody who is associated with Kiev for me, I thought about Max Levin. Max Levin was a Ukrainian photographer. He was from the Kiev region. I met him in the course of my work when he and his journalist colleague reached out to the UN with a request to facilitate access to a remote village in eastern Ukraine. During the course of our interaction, he came across as a seasoned professional with a brave determination to tell the story of people affected by the war in eastern Ukraine. He cooperated with humanitarian organizations, including the UN. In his determination to document the Russian aggression against Ukraine in February 2022, he ventured to the Kiev region, which was at the time occupied by the Russian armed forces. On 13 March 2022, Max and his friend went missing. Their bodies were found on 1st April 2022 after the retreat of the Russian armed forces from the Kyiv region. The investigation by the Reporters Without Borders indicates that Max Levin was executed by the Russian armed forces while unarmed and wearing a press jacket. He is survived by his wife and 4 children. Just as a side note, I want to mention that more media workers were killed covering the war in Ukraine, 12 in total, than in any other country in 2022. Overall, our family lived in Kiev for over 4 years. And it's really hard for me to see the images of ravaged residential areas in the Kyiv region.
Sorry, we also left under very trying circumstances. We also left right the day of the war, so we just took our suitcase, we left our 2 apartments and our stuff, so it's a little bit moving on to the street.
So where we spent a lot of time with our Ukrainian friends. Some of our friends and our nanny were stuck in their homes in the Kyiv region under Russian occupation. They were all eventually able to relocate to safety. The crimes committed by the Russian armed forces in the Kyiv region have been well documented by my colleagues from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And they are available online for anyone who wants to look at them closely. Sorry about that. But I want to go back in time and talk a little bit about the city where we started our journey in Ukraine. Back in 2016, we landed in Dnipro, formerly known as Dnipropetrovsk, a name it acquired under the Soviet rule. It is located on the bank of the river Dnipro in the eastern part of Ukraine. Its history dates back to the 16th century. From 18th century to 1926, until the arrival of the communists to power, it was known as Yekaterinoslav, after the Russian Empress Catherine the Great. It was also the administrative center of Novorossiya, or Malorossiya, as mentioned earlier by Manav. During the Cold War, the city was known as the Rocket City, and it was actually closed to foreigners. It produced a substantial number of the Soviet rockets. After the war in 2014, it provided a refuge to many Ukrainians fleeing the wars in eastern Ukraine in 2014 and in 2022. Most recently, perhaps many of you heard this, on January 14, 2023, Dnipro came under the deadliest attack by the Russian Federation, where a missile hit a residential building, killing over 40 people, injuring 75, and with 46 individuals still missing. But before everything that I just mentioned, Dnipro was just a normal city. This is beautiful Dnipro. Again, murals, really interesting art. This is the neighborhood where we live. And these are our kids, just having fun like any other kids in the city center. So Dnipro for me is associated with my former colleague and one of my closest friends from Ukraine, Irina Pavlik. Irina used to live in Dnipro. She's married and has 2 children. Irina used to work in marketing, but following the 2014 war, she started helping people fleeing violence in eastern Ukraine as a volunteer. She joined the UN Refugee Agency shortly after her volunteer work and spent 5 years working for the UN Refugee Agency, helping individuals fleeing conflict in eastern Ukraine. Irina's true passion was always women's rights, as you can see from this little poster that we made for the 16 Days Against Violence. Despite not having a formal education in the relevant field, she put herself through many courses and learning opportunities to gain knowledge and help those in need. She has many stories of helping women survivors of domestic violence, sex workers, single mothers, many of whom she literally picked up from the streets. In 2021, she joined the UN Women as a technical specialist and was very proud of this achievement. She was looking forward to moving to Kiev. She now lives in Kiev, so her dream came true, but it has a little bit of a bitter point. She is away from her husband and her second son, who decided to remain in Dnipro. She is very stoic in the face of the regular power cuts and lack of heating. She told me that despite being terrified for her life and that of her family members, she chooses to remain in Ukraine and continue helping women and girls. This is Irina. Now I want to move on to my 2 years spent in the Donbass, in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, documenting human rights violations where the conflict was most active. This is the video I took during my very first trip to the contact line. Contact line is basically the area that divides government-controlled territories from non-government controlled territories where the armed groups supported by Russia rule. And it is also the site of the most active conflict. As you can see on the video, there's a lot of destruction. Houses are empty, a lot of them are basically unlivable. This is Donbass in winter. Winters get really cold in Ukraine, as you know, and this was the only time where our cars let us down. They broke halfway and we couldn't proceed with our trip, so we had to get out. But I got to take this picture. I think this is really, it's the beauty of the region. This is Donbass in a different season. The famous sunflowers and the blue sky of Ukraine, which is also reflected in its flag. Many expats used to go in the fields and take a picture with the sunflowers, etc. I mean, I don't have a picture like that, I took it from a distance. But it's beautiful. This is the old car that let us down, but I want to pay attention, I want to direct your attention to the background. Those are residential buildings. This is the city of Avdiivka, which is right on the contact line. It is really close to the area where active hostilities take place. The building was ravaged both by armed groups from the Donetsk side, it's in Donetsk region, as well as Ukrainian defenders, because they had to defend themselves. The owners of these apartments are still trying to access reparations. They lost their property, many of them are displaced, but they're still fighting. However, I don't know when it's going to be resolved, because Avdiivka is now the hotspot. If you follow the news, every few days you hear that it's being shelled. It's basically under active fire from the armed groups and Russia. This is also Donetsk region. This is an area, an open area near the village of Sartana. You can see there is Kalmius River, and this river basically divides this whole area into two parts. This part is government control, the other part is where the armed groups are, and they're supported by Russia. So armed groups used to shell regularly from these positions towards the residential areas in Sartana village. You can see the fresh crater. This is an older one. So Sartana village, like many other villages and Mariupol, had a significant Ukrainians of Greek origin. Life in this village was very difficult. The people couldn't do basic things such as bury their dead. So the cemetery used to be in an open area, and every time a procession would venture out to place their dead person into the grave, they would be shelling. So sometimes the grave diggers and the family members had to take shelter for hours in the hole that was basically dug to bury their dead body. This is a wall painting in the Greek school in Chermalik, if I'm not mistaken. Now I can't remember. Yes, this mini knows. It was one of the few schools that was teaching Greek to the members of Ukrainian Greek community. I believe right now Chermalik is uninhabitable. I just hope that people were able to evacuate, but this is also both Sartana and Chermalik, like many other villages in southern Ukraine and cities, are a place of really active hostilities. This is, before I talk about this beautiful lady, I'd like to mention Mariupol, and if we have time, there is a really short video made by Associated Press about Mariupol. I think they did a really good job. They were present on the ground for a really long time, and it just portrays the horror that the residents of Mariupol went through during the Russian occupation. So Mariupol is a very interesting city. Mariupol grew as a city on one of the oldest settlements in Ukraine. It used to be a Cossack encampment, but starting from the 19th century, it played a major role in the industrialization of Ukraine. It is one of Ukraine's major port cities, and has a strategic importance due to direct access to the Black Sea through the Sea of Azov. Before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Mariupol used to have close to 500,000 residents. Since May 2022, it remains under the Russian occupation. During the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Mariupol was razed to the ground, burying its residents under the rubble or in makeshift graves in yards, gardens, and the city beaches. So I'd like to talk about Alexandra. This is Alexandra Potenko Picharji. She's the leader of the Greek community in Ukraine. She is an imposing lady who would command authority as soon as she enters the room. Alexandra is very passionate about uniting and preserving the Greek community in Ukraine. If you talk to her about the Greeks in Ukraine, she would start from the 18th century mass forced exodus of the Greeks from Crimea by the Russian Empire, and their subsequent settlement in the areas around the Azov Sea, including Mariupol. She would tell you about the languages that have been lost, and how she and her fellow activists have been trying to revive and preserve the Greek culture in the region. She had a well-equipped office in Mariupol. This is actually her office where I met her, and was working hard to keep the connection to the Greek community members who were forcefully separated from the rest of Ukraine by the 2014 war. Mariupol and its surroundings used to be home to the most of Ukrainians of Greek origin. Alexandra was very outspoken and sent a written cry for help from her bomb shelter while under the Russian siege. She warned against destruction of the predominantly Greek settlements in southern part of the Donetsk region, which came under massive attack by the Russian armed forces. Currently, the Greek community members from Mariupol are scattered across Ukraine and the world, or remain under the Russian occupation. Alexandra herself was able to escape Mariupol and is currently in Greece. Is that correct? Ismini?
Well, thank you. Alexandra will be so emotional for this presentation today. No, I don't want, this is your presentation. I don't have a lot to say more because Nigora said it all very, very accurately. Yes, Alexandra is now living in Athens and she's trying to raise awareness about the plight of all the Ukrainian people. I mean, they're members of the Greek minority of Ukraine, but everybody's Ukrainian. And she's trying to keep the uprooted Greeks of Ukraine that are now in Greece, she's trying to keep them together, and everybody's doing a huge awareness raising effort through campaigns and fundraising. And the special tragic character of that particular community is that they have been living separated even since 2014, because the separatists, when they took over the parts of Donbass, the eastern part of Donbass, they pretty much cut that community in half, because they were scattered throughout the, let's say that, southeastern area of Ukraine. So they would sleep with shelling and gunshots noises every night from 2014 till, well, then their city was razed to the ground. There's nothing left of Mariupol now. And to my knowledge, most of them have left, or at least women and families have left Ukraine, or for sure they've left Mariupol. So just to add my voice to support and say that Ukrainians deserve to dream of a better future, and they have the right to do that without a big bully over their heads. That's all that every people on earth should be fighting for.
Thank you, Ismini. Just to explore the Donetsk region more, this is Svetohirsk Cave Monastery. Do you like the picture? It's beautiful, right? Well, this place has been damaged really substantively. And this bridge, this is my photograph. So the bridge where I'm standing and taking the photograph is destroyed. So this monastery used to also house internally displaced persons. I mean, it's a technical term. Basically people who fled the violence in 2014. 400, 500 of them were still staying there until the war. Most of them, I think, were evacuated. There's a controversy about under which church it is, but I'm not going to dig deeper into that. But I just want to say that this is also a cultural heritage of Ukraine, and it has been damaged during this war. I mean, overall, apart from human loss, there has been so much damage to cultural heritage, to the environmental heritage of Ukraine. The museums have been looted and plundered. Environmental damage probably going to take decades, if not centuries, to kind of revert itself back to what it used to be. This is a ceramic workshop. This is not my photograph, it's the photograph of the Ukrainer project photographers. This is also native to the Donetsk region. So these small workshops used to be scattered around Slovyansk, which is very close to Svetohirsk, that is in the previous picture. And they used to make these kind of beautiful art pieces from the locally available clay. This is also potentially lost legacy because without access to the special clay, the masters, the craftsmen and craftswomen cannot do their work. This is another video shot in the Donetsk region. You can listen, I think, to our conversation. I'll shut up for a sec. Okay, in this video we're looking for an old lady. She's 82 years old. She lives with her disabled son, who is 67 years old. And they live in the village Piski, which is also in the Donetsk region. It's a closed village. Only international organizations had access to it. And it used to be a very wealthy suburb of the Donetsk city. You can see from the houses how big they are. Wealthy people living in Donetsk used to have their farmhouses in this village, and it was one of the, I think, one and only places where I saw a private chapel within a private yard right on the bank of Siversk River. It was very interesting. Sorry, not the river, there was a little kind of like artificial lake. So this lady was one of the 11 people who chose to remain in the village. When I was working in Ukraine, a lot of people used to ask me, why didn't they leave? Why didn't they leave? You know, what are they doing there? Like, why can't they just go? But, you know, once you talk to these individuals who chose to stay, most of them are elderly or disabled, who don't have any income, you understand that they don't have any other options. They lived and worked their entire life to save up for a little house where they hoped to spend the rest of their lives. But it didn't happen. So they could not relocate. This lady, she's 82 years old. She has a severely disabled 67-year-old son. When I asked her, we eventually found her. When I asked her, so what are you gonna do if you pass away? You know, like you don't have documents. Who's gonna take care of your son? She said, I don't wanna think about it. It's too overwhelming, I don't wanna think about it. You know, and I said, do you have any relatives? She said, yes, I do, but you know, they have their own lives. I mean, who's gonna take care of me and my disabled son if I go and, you know, stay with them? Who's gonna do that? So she was there entirely dependent on humanitarian aid and under constant shelling, because this was also one of the very active kind of like war, active hostility zones in the Donetsk region.
Sorry, I hope we're not destroying your
But this is the truth. This is not my photograph. This is again from the Ukrainian project. By the way, I invite those of you who want to learn a little bit more about Ukraine in a very accessible way. You can just go on their website, watch their videos. They talk. They do really good quality work. This is again Donetsk region, one of my first trips to the contact line. This is the village of Opitne, and this picture has a very kind of tragic and sad story behind it, where at the site where an elderly woman burned alive because she was using open fire to warm up at night. So she basically kind of her whole house burned down. And Opitne didn't have electricity for 7 years. It had about 36 residents, again, people who couldn't leave anywhere, they couldn't just take off. But they lived without electricity for 7 years. And finally, in 2021, through the efforts of this gentleman, Radion, they were able to get connection to the electricity grid. They were elated. The ladies, the older ladies that I talked to, they were so happy. But their happiness was short-lived because in February 2022, you know what happened. And this is one of the very active hostility zones. Radion's wife was injured, I think when the war just started. But he still works, he still provides whatever help he can. So this is Christina from Toretsk, also Donetsk region. Before I talk about Christina, I want to talk a little bit about Toretsk, about how it is to live in Toretsk. The history of the city dates back to the 19th century. Toretsk is a city of coal mines and miners, which had been in decline for the past decade or so. The economy of the city was already struggling following the 2014 war. Toretsk is located just a few kilometers away from the territories occupied by armed groups and Russia. Its water supply system came under regular attacks, and city inhabitants were left without water on a regular basis. This is before 2022. Following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the city has been under regular shelling by the Russian armed forces. Its critical infrastructure is in shambles, and just like many parts of Ukraine, people there mostly live without electricity and heating. So now I want to talk about Christina. I mean, as you can see, I chose really different characters just to convey the diversity of Ukraine. So Christina is one of the most generous women I've ever met. She's a civil rights activist from Toretsk and a leader of an NGO that advocates for the rights of Roma or Romani community in Toretsk in the greater Donetsk region. She has 5 children, 3 of them are adopted. She is of Roma origin and also an internally displaced person who was forced to leave her house in Donetsk and relocate to the government-controlled territory of Ukraine in 2014. She worked on increasing literacy level in her community by offering Ukrainian language classes to Romani men and women. For those of you who don't know, just as a background, Romani people in Ukraine, just like in many parts of Europe, are marginalized and face discrimination, which affects their ability to access basic services such as education, healthcare, and employment. After the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Christina and her family briefly fled her home. But as I learned yesterday, she was forced to come back to Toretsk because she ran out of money to pay for her rent at a different, safer location. While she was away, a shell landed in her yard, causing damage to her house. She said that her school-age children are struggling to continue their education due to frequent electricity cuts and are deeply affected psychologically and are deeply psychologically affected by the constant shelling of the town. I'll be honest, it was very difficult to gain Christina's trust because Roma community, they do not speak to outsiders readily. But after many meetings, we connected and we still stay in touch. I wanted talk a little bit about the Luhansk region, which was also part of the area of responsibility, as we call it in the UN language. This is a photograph of a building that I took near the water filtration plant. It was abandoned, but the water filtration plant was also heavily shelled and people briefly lost access to fresh water. So, despite the conflict and despite what we call the contact line, people of Ukraine, people from both sides still travel back and forth. How do they do that? They do it through checkpoints. This is one of the main and very important checkpoints, Stanica Luhanska, where it was basically a pedestrian checkpoint, so no cars allowed, and people had to walk over a kilometer to cross either side. And very importantly, it remained open for the most part of COVID pandemic, because the checkpoints in the Donetsk regions were closed. So this was the only bridge for individuals like this lady who was crossing to collect her pension. Most of the people who basically cross the contact line are older people. They have to cross from a government-controlled territory to the government-controlled territory to collect their pension. There were also other Ukrainians who had to get their IDs, who had to attend funerals, who basically do any other basic stuff that we kind of take for granted in our daily lives.
I just want to clarify, if everyone knows, non-government controlled territory basically means under Russian occupation or Russian rebels or people supported by Russia. Government control means government of Ukraine. So they're crossing, if they're living on what is now Russian controlled, but they're Ukrainians, they have to cross over on that bridge to get their pension.
I don't know where we stand with the crossings right now. I don't think there are any crossings at this point, as far as I believe, because Stanica Luhanska was occupied by Russia. The UN international community invested a lot of money to make it, to allow people to cross in dignity, installing latrines, benches, shelter from weather elements, having golf carts to transport disabled people back and forth. This all has been, I think, now, I don't know, maybe destroyed. We don't know. This is a very close cut. This is right next to Stanica Luhanska. So in December, when I was on the ground, we already saw the escalation of conflict. We saw that areas that were previously not targeted were being shelled. This is a house of a lady who lives right next to the checkpoint. As you can see, the shrapnel landed right above her bed, and she told us a story. She said she was sitting here literally minutes before the shrapnel landed there. She just kind of got up to get drink, like water or something, and that basically saved her life. Because on the same day, a municipal worker was injured due to shrapnel. So we saw these signs. We knew that the situation is not getting better, but it's getting worse. Another story. This is a village also in Luhansk region, a remote village, not easy to access. A village on the bank of the Siversk River. This lady, she lives alone in this house, and she was explaining to me that she is a boat ride away from her family. So basically, if she crosses the Siversk River on the boat, right across, that's where her children, adult children and grandchildren lived. But she couldn't do it because the territory was divided, like Manav said, between the Russia armed groups and government of Ukraine, and it was dangerous, it was illegal to cross this way. So she hasn't seen her family members for 7 years. This picture was taken in 2021, and she was explaining to me that, this is the situation.